You feeling good? Okay. I'm going to do something that's unheard of at a prophecy conference. How many of you like history? Wow, look at the... Oh, all right, now you ruined all my jokes because you all put your hands up. That's not funny. Okay. Well, I'm going to do something unheard of in history. Let me start there. We're going to cover 6,000 years of history in the next 1 hour. I'm going to skip over a lot of it. And I promise to have you out of here by about, well, 1 a.m., 1:30, somewhere around in there, okay? So I'll start talking, maybe I can cut it back to 1:15. This is kind of a Middle East update, and we are going to actually look at some history things, but I promise you I'm going to teach it in ways that you probably didn't learn it anywhere else in the past. Partly because I make a lot of fun of it, but there's going to be two important points that I want you to take home from this when we leave here tonight. And I'm not going to spill the beans, I'm going to build to these things, because one of the things that you're probably asking yourself is what actually is going on in the Middle East. And when you look at these, we know the Middle East is in turmoil. I mean, does anybody not know the Middle East is in trouble? What's really nice about what we're going to talk about tonight, it dovetails very accurately with what Rabbi Cohen was talking about, and he's become such a good friend to us out here at our church, and even our end times class. We've had a number of private lessons with him, and I can tell you that the kind of things that he can share with us are absolutely unbelievable. And from a couple of our past classes with him, one of the things I wanted to do was put together something to put this in a historical perspective, because people say, why is this happening? And you've seen a couple of the pictures up there. Rabbi Cohen asked a very interesting question earlier when he said, well, if there's going to be civil war there, and God told you that, why did you go? Because a lot of people say, well, we should get out of there, a lot of peaceniks, and they all want everybody to come home, but for the wrong reasons. The question is, what were we doing there in the first place? And we're going to evaluate some of these things and try to unravel whether this is a chicken or egg issue as to whether God knew there was going to be civil war and problems there because we were going to be there, or we're just there meddling and wouldn't really have any effect on it. But two important things that'll come out of this by the end of the evening. Or later this evening, one of the two. Okay, here's the big question. Who's really to blame for the Middle East? Now, there's a lot of usual suspects here that we can often blame. I mean, there's obviously Islam. Are they the ones to blame for the Middle East? There's kind of a natural tendency to say, yeah, sure, it's them, because they're the bad guys and we're the good guys, so that's kind of an easy way out. But is it Israel? And I don't know if you guys noticed, but Israel's getting the blame for everything today. Nobody likes them. Anti-Semitism is on the rise like it has never been before, and in some cases even eclipsing what was happening pre-World War II. This should not be a surprise to you, and I doubt it is. That's why you guys are here at this kind of conference. But God said it would. God said this was going to happen. And Israel is now a focal point for everybody's hatred. You see this rising in Europe, you see it rising here in the US, certainly it's across all of Islam. Is it this guy's fault? Don't really know. I just threw that in there. There is another suspect. Is it us? Are we the ones to be blaming for this? Does Christianity play any kind of a role in this? Well, this is what we're going to investigate, but we need to go back a long ways in this, because one of the problems that we have is not understanding how we got here. And you know the old story about those that don't know their history are doomed to fail it and repeat it and do all of those things again. And that's no more true than it is now and than any other time in the past. So I want to take you back. Does anybody recognize that date? In fact, I'll give you the exact date, October 23rd, 4004 BC. Well, according to this guy, that was the beginning of it all. You've probably heard of James Ussher. He wrote the Annals of History, and he was an exceptionally good documenter and researcher, and he went back through the Bible and placed the beginning at October 23rd, 4004 BC. We all know we've been around here 6,000 years. Those of you that still like the old age Earth and old age universe and evolution. I'm going to bash those really good in the next couple of sessions. I hope you come back for those. I'll let it go for now, though, okay? Yeah, I'll have a few things. James Ussher put it at this date. Most scholars will put it somewhere between 3800 BC to about 4100 BC. I like his because he did a lot of research and he has a big book that says that's what the date is, and I'm good with that. I wasn't there, I came a little after that, but he did a good job. So let's go with 4004 BC. That was where it all started, and it all started because God said, in the beginning, I created. I'm paraphrasing that, of course, that wasn't I. So God does this, and then we have this, okay? Yeah, that's what we're talking about here for the next 2 days. You're going to hear all the guys back here talk about it, so I'm going to avoid jumping in on this one, all right? Lots of fun stuff happened before the flood, okay? There's a key verse in the Bible when Jesus is talking and he's telling everybody, about the apostles in particular, why or what's going to happen at the end and when things are going to come. And there's a great little verse in there. It says, and it will be like it was in the days of Noah, okay? That's kind of the one everybody brushes over. Oh, we're going to be sinning. Show me 5 minutes in the 6,000 years of man's history when we haven't been sinning exactly the same way. No difference, no changes. So the question is, something has to tick off God. It happened once before, and it's happening again. Most of you have an inkling as to what that is, and we got 3 incredible marquee players here that are going to be talking about this for the next couple of days. So we'll just skip on and say, that's close enough. Okay, we got the idea. Let's jump ahead just a little bit. This happens sometime between 2300, 2500. All right? We have the flood. Flood wipes all that out, and we start all over again. What's happened since then? Well, what I would like to do is show you about 4,500 years of history in 90 seconds. Now, here's what I want to explain to you. Pastor Matt's going to cue this bad boy up. And these are our friends at Maps of War. I suggest you go to their site because they have some incredible maps. They're animated, and what they do is they kind of give you a great visualization of what's happened in history, and there's a whole bunch of them that you can choose from. We want to give a good shout out to these guys because they were very good in making some changes and doing some stuff for us, so I just want you to go to their website and check them out. What you're going to see is a video here, but what I want you to focus on is what's in the center. You're going to see 2 important cities. Now, we know in the Bible that there's a great conflict between Jerusalem and Babylon, God's holy city and the seat of Satan's throne here on earth. Now, what I want you to watch in this visualization is all of the empires, and you have to keep that word in mind because we're going to talk about it for the rest of this talk, empires. You're going to watch the battles and the wars that have gone on for 4,500 years in 90 seconds. It's a stunning visualization because what you're going to see are these 2 cities and the important role they play in it. So kind of focus on what's happening generally, but keep your eye on those 2 cities and watch what happens in these 90 seconds. What we fail to understand, especially in the Western mindset, is this empire mentality. This is Game of Thrones. This is Game of Empires that you're seeing right here. One after the other, running all over this land that we are now focused on intently since, of course, the rebirth of the nation of Israel. But do you see who's right in the middle of it? You think for a second there's not a war going on between Satan and God? And you saw all the things you saw in the Bible. You saw Israel get overrun by Assyria, by the Babylonians. You saw it all happen. That's what it was. Israel has always been in the middle of this. God's holy people, his holy city, and what's going on for 4,500 years. And yet you're wondering what's going on now. The same thing is going on now. It's been going on for 4,500 years. But there's some other interesting twists as to what's going on in there. And you start to see it toward the end of this, but a great visualization I think these folks put together. So again, if you'd like to see this more times, what I'd like you to do is go to Maps of War, and you can see not just this, but others that they've done, and it's a great lesson as to what's going on. I want you to take a little closer look at this now, because you probably recognize this. I'm going to take you back to the beginning, and usually these next few slides I can talk hours on. I'm not going to do it here. We're going to skip through it because you did get that visualization. There's other things that I want to take you to see. But this is the beginning. This is back when it all began, and we see right after the flood, Mesopotamia comes into existence. And you've all heard about the ancient Sumerians. And it's funny because back in school, even as a kid, I remember learning about, the beginning of history. You take this in world history and ancient history. And they talk about the ancient Sumerians. And I loved reading about them. I mean, I wasn't that much of a history nut, but I thought this was pretty cool stuff. And what always bothered me, and I never put it together until later, and I really came to the Lord and really began to understand the young earth, because I had it drilled into my head. We've been around for 4.5 billion years and all that other nonsense in the universe for 15 billion. And I couldn't understand how a civilization literally popped into existence, complete with philosophy, science, math, all the things that are way too intellectual to suddenly hit upon as you come out of the cave and plant a few beans in the ground. You don't make that kind of a quantum leap. It just didn't sit right with me. But there's a different understanding that I have now. We're going to be touching on some of those other things when we talk about evolution and some of the other stuff in the other talks. But it starts here in Mesopotamia, and what we're going to do is move this aside a little bit because I want to run through just a couple of things and point them out to you from that last view graph. And I will skip through a couple of these quickly. Don't worry about it. You're not missing anything from that point of view. But by about 2500 BC, we start to see the beginnings of civilization move from Mesopotamia and move outward. A little bit later on, by 1500 BC, we see Egypt and other countries start to come into existence. We start to see the spread of mankind throughout the Middle East. As we hit about 1000 BC, we see that Israel is there. We see that a lot of the things that we've read in the Bible, you'll start to recognize all the names that you guys actually see up there right now. By 500 BC, you see the extent of the Persian Empire. Now Persia, we're talking Iran. Now keep in mind who's today's players. Keep in mind who is one of the biggest of the empires in the Middle East in 500 BC. You see the Persian Empire. They're going to keep rearing their ugly heads throughout the next 2,500 years, but you see by 500 BC they owned it. That was the Middle East. You have the breakup with the Greeks by about 200 BC. You see the beginnings of the Roman Empire, which was prevalent at the time of Christ in the Holy Land. By 200 AD, you see Parthia, which is again Persia in a different format. That's what you've got going on there. And you start to see, by the way, the Roman Empire start to degrade. By 500 AD, the Roman Empire is just a shell of its old self. But you see the Persian Empire come back. You wonder why the Iranians are vying for position today. They always had a big position out here, always. Then the Caliphate starts. What have you been hearing about recently? The return of the Caliphate. Now the problem is there's two vying factors that are going after this return of the Caliphate, and it's part of what's going on in the geopolitical world in the Middle East right now. But you see the caliphate is there, and you see the size of these things, by the way. This was the Middle East, Northern Africa, all the way up into Turkey. You see it break up yet again. But what I want you to see is I'm going to skip through a couple of these graphs because this gets a little more detailed in getting into this. But what I want to take you to is what starts to happen here, and we start to see the Turks. Now, who are the Turks? Turkey. Okay? Another player. We started talking about Turkey in our classes going back about 4 years ago. They were on the rise. What have you heard about Turkey in the last couple of years? Yeah, see, silence, huh? They sort of took a back position, didn't they? Who's taking all the heat right now? Iran. See, Turkey's playing a kind of a moving game here. They're hiding out. But Turkey is a player in this, and I'll show you why. Because as we come up here, guess who the next big player is by 1648? Now, this is after the founding of America, and look who's really big in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire is the Turks. It's Turkey. You see, they owned it too. So you've got the Persians that owned it. You've got the Ottomans that owned it. And again, we wonder why this is all going on in the Middle East. This is the real history. This is what's going on. These are game of empires. Even by 1789, and do you sort of recognize that year with respect to us? Right around when we started becoming what we are. The Ottoman Empire was big there. By 1837, you still have the Ottoman Empire, although the viceroyalty in Egypt is there. And the reason that came about is because you start to see the meddling of the West. You start to see Britain involved. You start to see the rest of the Western nations, and they're all over the Middle East. What do you perceive as the difference between the way we do things in the West and the way they do things in the Middle East? They're empires. You can liken it to our American Indians. Did they have states? Did they have borders? Did they have boundaries? Well, yes, they had boundaries, but not states like we do. We're the ones who come in with the survey equipment, draw lines on everything. They ebbed and flowed with the land. They clearly knew where they were supposed to be and where their neighbors were, and there were often battles about that, but they didn't have the kind of lines that we do. I'm going to skip through a couple of these other than to show you, do you see the extent of the Ottoman Empire? You still have the Ottoman Empire. We're all the way up to 1914, and that's where we're going to stop right here. Because in 1914, who was prevalent in the Middle East? The Ottoman Empire, the Turks. What happened in 1914? World War I. I studied World War I. I got over it. Here was the problem. I never saw it as bizarre as I did when I went back to do research on these particular topics that we're talking about here. When I say this was a bizarre war, we could spend an entire conference on this and never scratch the surface of how bizarre this war actually was. Let me give you a little bit of an idea. And by the way, I do want to just point out to you time maps. That last set of maps that I used was from these folks. They're in England. They do a lot of these maps, and there's a lot of great detail about what goes on in all these empires. I suggest you check out timemaps.com, another great place to look. So you got Maps of War and timemaps.com, two great places to go. It's free to look at these things, and there's great stuff out there. Here's World War I. I'm going to point out some highlights that I think are going to surprise you a lot about this. There are two major powers here that everybody says, well, this was World War I. You got the Central Powers, Austria, Hungary. Notice that is not Austria, that is not Hungary, as you know it. It's Austria-Hungary. It's an empire. It's a big plot of land. I'm going to show it to you. You got Germany, not the Germany you know. This was the German Empire, and they had a big plot of land. And you've got the Ottoman Empire. You already saw how big theirs was. And then you had the Allied powers, the United Kingdom, France, and the Russian Empire. By the way, when I say this was a bizarre war, Russia lost land, lost big time, and won. They were on the winning side. I'm going to show you some of the things they lost, and it's going to surprise you. The rest of those, the ones that are in yellow, came in later, after 1914. They came in dribs and drabs. Everybody wanted to get a piece of the action. To show you how really bizarre this is, the war went from 1914 to 1918. This is where it started, and you see in the Central Powers, and you see up here Germany. You see Germany, by the way? Oops, just did that. See Germany here? This is Germany today. What's all this? And you see Russia on the other side. Austria-Hungary doesn't look anything like Austria, doesn't look anything like Hungary. Very, very different. These were empires. At the end of the war, this is 1918. I want you to just take a look really quickly at who jumped in. Does that raise an eyebrow or just make you shake your head? I had no other point for this. I wasn't going anywhere with this view graph. I just wanted you to see how bizarre this war was, that as we reach the end of the war, we've got a whole bunch of South American countries jumping in on the war. Amazing. These are the outcomes of the war. So we've gone through the entire war now. But the keys that I want you to see here is the four major powers: German, Russian, Austria-Hungarian, and this one ceased to exist. In the course of a war, these empires were forced into non-existence. Ottoman Empire, gone. If you take a look at what happened here, now of course this was the Paris Peace Treaty here, and the players and stuff. I want to show you the series of treaties that got into this. Normally you would think when a war ended, what would happen? They'd all get together at a table, they'd have a big treaty, sign it, and be done. Not so much. There were independent nations that were restored or created. This is also the time the League of Nations was formed. This is the precursor to the United Nations. I want to show you the peace treaties. There's something even more bizarre here about this, but I want you to get just a feel for the peace treaties that existed to end this war. You think that's all of them? There's another page. And I had to lump some of them together. As you can see down here, there were 3 United States treaties and 14 other formal agreements to end World War I. What becomes even more bizarre about this is a couple of them that I'm going to pick out for you later and show you exactly what happened. But this was an ethnic and cultural disaster. Most of you are familiar, you probably learned in school about Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. In fact, being half Czech myself, these were countries that I thought I came from. I had no idea they were made up. Did you ever wonder why they crumbled back in the Clinton era, and you had Serbia and the Croatians and all those other folks, and all of a sudden we had all these other countries? That's because they were there before. They just wanted them back. Czechoslovakia was not a thing. They made it up. So what you did was you took a bunch of people, all of whom were different culturally, different ethnically, and said, oh, now you're all a big country. You recall when they talked about Saddam Hussein was bombing his own people? He never bombed his own people. He had Shia, Sunni, and Kurds in there. He didn't like the Kurds, but they weren't his people. So you took a line, drew it around a big area, and said, you're Iraq, you're Iran, you're these other countries. You enveloped people who never played well together in the sandbox. No pun intended. I thought of that after I said that, and I'm sorry, I apologize, I'm sorry. You see what got broken up here. This is what happened to this area. We put people together who never were together, never belonged together, destroyed empires which were doing well on their own, even though they fought over 4,500 years. What's interesting is Russia, which was on the winning side, actually lost Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. You wonder why Russia's perpetually angry. These are one of the reasons. Now, you probably never saw World War I this way, but this is the problem that it caused. It was a battle and a war, but here's the inside story with some of these things. I want you to just take a quick look at the Indo-European culture. I don't want you to take a lot of things away from this, except do you notice that the lines that represent all the different colorations and the striations and stuff that are there represent cultures? And do you see how they kind of overlap all of the borders of the countries that are there in the Middle East and in Europe? Very odd. This was a great study that was done. It pointed out, and I know it's hard to read because there's just so much on this graph. It's actually a way bigger graph, but these are all the different culture groups and languages that are out here, and you can see how people speak things that have nothing to do with the actual countries that they exist in. They overlap borders, seriously. Take a look at before and after, and all of a sudden you start to see things like, if you notice up here, you got Germany, all of a sudden you have Poland. Who invaded Poland in the Second World War? Do you understand why? Because that was Germany. Do you understand why the Russians invaded them? Because part of it was Russia. If you take a look at what was there and then what we created, and then you jump ahead to the Second World War and to the fighting and what's going on now, you start to see why people are angry and still trying to recover from World War I. This is one of the problems. We learned a great deal about this actually from Rabbi Cohen when he mentioned this earlier. The name of it is the Asia Minor Agreement. That's what it's called. It's referred to as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I want you to look at the date that I put yellow. Now think about when was World War I. Does it strike you odd that the agreement was signed 2 years before the end of the war? People were already, a year into the war, divvying up the land, figuring out what they were going to do when they won the war. Those agreements that I showed you, those dozens of them, were not all signed at the end of the war. Many of them were signed during the war. Sides were being chosen. Land was being picked up. The division was already there based on what we were going to win and how we were going to win it and what we were going to wind up with. Very strange. Rarely has this ever happened in history, and never to this extent. So what happened is the Sykes-Picot Agreement here was this secret agreement, and it basically did this. Who was going to have control over the Middle East after they defeated the Ottoman Empire? The Sykes-Picot Agreement said these kinds of things. It disintegrated the Ottoman Empire. The controlling powers were left free to decide on state boundaries within those areas. Now, you can read down some of those other lines quickly, but basically what they did is they carved up the entire Ottoman Empire. They made states out of it. Who was the big player in this? Britain. And what did they do? Just put boundaries around everything because we wanted a piece of this, you want to get a piece of that, we'll give you some of this, you give us some of that. This was already done before the war ended. 2 years, well, 20 months before the war ended. Amazing. Now you might say, well, what does this really have to do with anything? I'm going to give you a couple of other clues and then I'm going to show you the outcome of what's really going on here. This is Lord Balfour. I believe he was a pretty honest man. I think he had Israel's heart, a heart for Israel at the time. I think he tried to do his best. You probably have heard about the Balfour Agreement, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the way he envisioned it and then what happened. But again, see, here's the key to this. You see the date? Lord Balfour, 1917, again, before the end of the war, was already writing these letters to say, I want to do this for Israel after we beat them. I want to do this with the land after we beat them. So not a bad guy. He had something in mind here, especially for Israel. I'll show you the outcome of this, though. It was a thing called the British Mandate. And what happened is, you can see the date here. The British Mandate came out at the end of the war. It was part of the agreements. It was essentially to be based on the Balfour Agreement. It wasn't quite based on that. But I want you to look at the land there that was part of what was called the British Mandate. All right? You see the size of this. When they sat down to negotiate this, the Israelis, being practical, knew they probably weren't going to get it, but they were hoping for this. Now, most of you kind of recognize the map of Israel, and you can see they didn't even quite get that. They were a little bit shocked about that. But the bottom line is they got basically what's over here. They were hoping for this. They were supposed to get all of it, but the negotiations said, you're going to love this. The negotiation said, we'll give this to Israel, the Jewish people. We're going to give this to the displaced Palestinians. You probably never quite heard it that way. That was what the negotiation was about. So what are they talking about today? What do we want Israel to do today? Yeah, the two-state solution. Take what you got and now give up some of that. Because somewhere along the line, this guy, Amir Abdullah, was given the Transjordan, which suddenly today became Jordan. Now, do you know what the Transjordan means? The other side of the river. That's why it was called the Transjordan. But back in 1920, it was decided that we would have a two-state solution. One for the Jewish people and one for the displaced Palestinians. So when people are talking about they want a two-state solution today because Israel's an apartheid state, are at the very, very best being simply disingenuous. The very worst, they're just outright liars. Bottom line. So when you hear people talking about a two-state solution, you know they don't know their history. And they obviously don't know what Israel has already given up. Now, here's what's even more entertaining about a lot of this. How did God, you remember him? When you're up on this stage, you have to say, God. But what did God say about Israel? Well, we can find it. I like this one in Deuteronomy here, 11:24. He's basically saying, you go walk around, wherever you walk, you're going to get it. Okay, I know I'm paraphrasing God. I shouldn't do that. I apologize again. But we know that Abraham did all of this. So Abraham was all over the place. You probably remember when he was down here, even in Ur and things like that. He got into all kinds of trouble and did this. And you know the whole story of Abraham. It's fun to read. But he covered essentially all of this. All right? Well, there's more, because God says in Genesis, I'm going to give you this. Now, there's something I want you to pick out as we're looking at these. I'm going to show it to you when we get to the next slide. But in here he talks about this. He makes his covenant with Israel because he says to your descendants, and by the way, if you're into it all, replacement theology, please stop. Okay, most of you are familiar with that. And no, we have not replaced Israel, and God's promise to the Israeli people has never been broken. That should be painfully obvious to us because they got it back. They're going to get it all back. Right? You do know that, right? So, yes, amen is right. First day of my class 14 years ago, I said, let me talk to you all about prophecy. It's all about the Jews. That was the bottom line. I haven't really wavered from that at all. It belongs to Israel. Well, it belongs to God. He wants Israel there. They're going to be there. So if you read this, you come up with this swatch of land. And if you read this one, which I think is one of the most entertaining of it, there's one key in here that changes the others a little bit, and you can see it here. The Hittites. Remember in the graphs I showed you, early on, the Hittite Empire was up there in kind of the northern country. They're actually up here. You know what that is? Turkey. Yeah, once again, it rears its ugly head. If you read what God says and you understand, Rabbi Cohen talked to you earlier about Psalm 83 and why that is something that's going to happen, why that's something that hasn't happened before, because if you read the list of players in there, they've all come against Israel, just not all together that way. You got to go back. You got to know your Old Testament history. You got to know your Old Testament people, and you got to know where they are. But when God talks about this and he describes land, you got to know the land they came from. You got to know who they are. And if you look at it from that perspective, this is actually, it's a reasonably good approximation. This is what God gave to Israel. Do you see what that overlaps? Do you wonder why there's a problem? and why for 4,500 years Satan and God have been rolling over this land for 4,500 years. It hasn't stopped since right after the flood. And you're wondering why all the turmoil today. Welcome to this world, okay? Where's Israel today? There's the world. This one's done, by the way, based on religions, prevailing religions in the area. There's a clue there as to where we're going with this, by the way, one of the two important points I want you to take away from this. Do you see it? Rabbi gave you a great example. I'm giving you the little visualization up here because Rabbi Cohen was using this, and that was pretty accurate. Because there's the world. You can't see it. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because what I want you to be able to do is just take a look at the Muslim world, and that's not all of the Muslim world. Where have they spread big time? Indonesia, down in there, other areas, but, well, they're spreading everywhere, but in terms of like, they're really Islamic countries. You got the whole Southeast Asia area gone big time. Again, do you see Israel? I apologize to those who have red-green color blindness, but I had a point I want to make about this, so I had to use it. So for those of you that maybe suffer from that, this is all green. And of course, I'm pointing with a red pointer, so that doesn't help you either. So I give up. It's late. I apologize. I'm having fun with you. I tried to get no, they only make these colors. Anyway. So anyway, for those of you who can see it, all of this is, of course, Islamic countries to one degree or another. And of course, you guys know where it is. I'm not trying to claim you don't, but right in there, that little red spot, that's Israel. Less than 1/1000th of the land they have. Do you remember there are two promises in the Bible? Right? There were two promises in the Bible dealing with this exact situation. And what was Ishmael going to get? Was he going to be blessed? Were his descendants going to be blessed? Are they blessed? Did they get all the oil? Did they get all that land? Did they get that? And yet we're still angry. They're angry everywhere. I don't get it. It's not enough and it's never enough. Now, why is it not enough and never enough? Because that's a really good point. Why? Because it's God's. You see, it's not about the Muslims. It's not about the Christians. It's between God and Satan. Satan wants to do this to God. God lets Satan play. He's been letting him do it for 6,000 years. He's going to slap him. God said exactly this was going to happen. The entire world will come against Israel. Doesn't necessarily mean that the entire world is going to take up arms and roll over there with tanks and go against Israel, but take a look even at the United States. Have you noticed the change in the United States in the last few years? It's been getting progressively worse, but the bottom line is it only takes us to remove that level of support, that level of coverage that we give them to embolden the enemies. You see it happening before you. The very worst people in the world have been used by God to carry out his desires. This is a battle between him and Satan. So don't be surprised that these things are happening. Don't be surprised. You may be angered by it. I am. That we seem to be, shunning our support of Israel. It's going to happen because God's got a purpose for that. But that's an amazing story right there. But there's something about that graph that you're going to remember because I'm going to talk to you about a couple more quick points that go to that. This, by the way, is Islam's position. Now, if you go to their site and you read, when I say Islam's position, in ISIS. Have you wondered about ISIS? See, Hezbollah and Hamas, they kind of morph into Al-Qaeda or whatever that is, and then you got the Muslim Brotherhood that popped up and went away. They're all very bad. They all think the other one is worse than the other one, and of course that's now become ISIS, and it doesn't seem to matter who we're fighting over there. They're all worse than the bunch before them, right? I mean, that's what their website actually says. Now, who reads that website knows what they're talking about? Well, these are just nut jobs. No, they have a mission. They're angry. Their specific goal, and I highlighted them for you, is to reverse the effects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's actually on their website. So you think World War I is over? No more than the folks in the South think the Civil War is over. No, it's not. That's what they're specifically going after. It says, and this was a comment made by Gotti back in 2014. He says, until we hit the last nail in the coffin of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's their whole goal. You wonder why they're angry? You wonder why they're upset? They're still ticked off about something that happened 100 years ago. And who did that? Who put that all in motion? People often ask, and they do always in our end times classes and others, they say, well, is America in the Bible? Is America a big end times player? And I say, oh yeah, America's in the Bible. It says, and the other nations. I know that, I know I'm being glib, and that saves me a whole lot of talk about that, but that's the way I see it. Are we a catalyst? How could you not be the most powerful nation on earth and not be a catalyst in things, to the good or the bad? So yeah, we're out there, but we're out there as one of the other nations. The central is Israel and all the rest of us. So yeah, we are lumped in, and we are in there, and we know how God feels about this. You often wonder about what we're talking about today in the, let's split up the land. Don't do that. God will be really angry. I got bad news for you. You did it 100 years ago. God's not happy at all. He hasn't been happy for 100 years, and he's obviously getting angrier because things are going south even faster than we can imagine. I want to talk to you about the seal. The AV guys are, yeah, they're a nice bunch. I work with great people. They're great sense. Thank you. I want to talk to you about the seal judgments. So let me move on to the next slide, and we'll talk here about the seal judgments. You guys, I don't want you. I spent about 20 years with naval intelligence, so I don't want you to think that I'm making fun of the SEALs, and I know many of them personally. I have a picture of a couple of my friends here. These are some of the best SEALs that I know. It's Bob and Ray up there. That's okay. Back to the SEAL judgments. You guys love Revelation, right? Honestly, it's not as tough a book as you would think it is, but I can tell you that we've done a great deal of misunderstanding. We've done a good job. We've picked it apart. We've talked about a lot of things. Some of you, like me, go back to, the Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins days and Left Behind, and these are great books. And we've all learned about all these things happening, and some of us have taken classes in these. And I want to look at Revelation 6, okay? Because this is where we start to talk about the seal judgments. And I'm not going to turn this into the whole thing because there's one specific thing I want to look at with you. You've heard about these guys, okay? And we think we know what they are. And we've done a pretty good job beating these guys up and trying to figure out what God meant. And by the way, he spent 8 verses, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8 verses to describe those guys. He goes on in another part to talk about that they're spirits, so that's why I put up there that, will be coming up that these are actually the spirits that are alive in the end time, okay? Now let's take a look at the 4 horsemen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want to point out to you who they are and who these players are. They are known spirits. That's what the Bible tells us about the 4 horsemen. All right, who's the first guy? Most biblical scholars will tell you that this is Christianity. They base that a lot on Catholicism because the Pope is always dressed in white, and white is a big deal with that. Jesus himself rides a white horse in when he comes back with all the angels. And the Pope, of course, has a white Pope-mobile, drives Alitalia has a white plane that he goes in. Everything is kind of white. If you ever watch a lot of Catholic and even Christian ceremonies and things, there's tremendous amounts of white. I mean, I know there's blazing color and stuff, but white seems to be very predominant. And when you read the description of what that horse is, it seems to play perfectly into the fact that this represents Christianity. Is Christianity a spirit alive in the end of days? Well, one, if you're a Christian, you know it is a spirit, and if you're here in the end of days and you know it, you say, okay, good, sounds like what it is. So who's this guy? Well, red, of course, has been associated with socialism. If you take a look at posters, if you take a look at almost everything, red is always associated with socialistic values and systems, okay? Now again, there's all studies done on this. Most of you guys, I'm sure, have probably been through them, so I'm just kind of refreshing something here. Black has always been associated with capitalism. We talk about the scales and all the other things that are out there. So again, if you go back and you carefully read verses, as I showed you here, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, you would come to these conclusions. 2 of them seem to be political, financial, social type systems. These 2. Are they competing? Very much so. Very much the opposite ends of the extreme. We've got this one out here that we associate with Christianity. There's not much, again, I hate to make these kind of statements because we know how fallible they are. The debate's over. These are kind of what most of the biblical scholars want to talk about. But there's always been one question that they've been a little bit loose on. Who's this guy? Now, you've read it in the Bible. In fact, if you remember, Clint Eastwood did a movie called Even Pale Rider. It's kind of what we throw out there. But this is what this guy has been called, depending on the version of the Bible that you have. Ashen, mottled, pale, grizzled. I actually saw that once, a bay horse, dappled. That's what he was called. What does that mean to you? Probably not much. It's been kind of a mystery. With all that we know about prophecy, the pale horse has been a real mystery. Well, the mystery, there it is. Anybody know Greek? I didn't until I looked it up, so don't feel bad. Anybody know Greek? It's chloros. That's, yes, very good. That's the word. It's chloros. Anybody know what chloros means? Yeah. Here's the thing. That word is used 4 times in the New Testament. 4 times. Here's 3 of them. I'm going to highlight a word there for you. In 3 of the cases, it was correctly rendered green. Green grass, green thing, or any tree, etc., etc. Do you know why it was rendered correctly? They knew what grass was, they knew what a tree was, they kind of got the impression and understood that it meant green. So they took chloros and said, these green things. Well, who loves green? Gee, you don't even need to know where that is, but do you recognize it? How about this one? Walk all around Jerusalem, and what you see are green everywhere, doors. Okay? Know what that is? That's the Empire State Building on Ramadan. Oh yeah, that's a shocker, isn't it? Uh-huh. Okay, take a look at these. This will give you another good idea. They do love green, don't they? Do we wonder now where we're going with this? It's not the pale horse, it's not the mottled horse, it's the green horse. Now, of course, when people did this 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when people translated the Bibles, who would have put a green horse? Now, have you seen mottled horses? Have you seen bay horses? Have you seen, yes, they exist all over the place. Nobody ever saw a green horse, so it was never translated that way. Now reread the sentence. I looked and behold, a green horse. And look at the things that this does to kill with sword, with famine, with pestilence, by the wild beasts of the earth. Key factor right here, gives them power over 1/4 of the earth. Nobody knew what that meant either. So now we got a green horse. This, by the way, is in the Greek. I just put this up here not for our Greek experts out there, but just so you can see the word chloros up there, that's what it is. Exactly the same word, exactly the same spelling as in the rest of the Bible. It's right there. Again, apologies to the color blindness. Okay, but we are talking green, so you better recognize it. Let's look at Islamism. That's actually a real word, by the way. I want you to take a look at that. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Are you getting it? They actually are now 1/4 of the population of Earth. And where do they have control over 1/4 of the population of the Earth? More than that, it's a powerful belief system. The rider is death. What follows is hell. To kill with a sword, the power. Those are the key phrases and the key words out there. And I think you can see what God was talking about. This isn't meant for the non-believers. This is not meant for folks that, you know, have a passing fancy with the Bible. This is for the believers. This is for the people who want to know. There's enough there. There's enough there for you to understand what's going on. You probably have often talked to people who will talk to you about, oh, you know, that scary stuff. I don't do that. I don't want to read that. I don't need to know prophecy. Everything's going to happen every way. God's in control. They kind of blow it away. I don't know about you folks, but I know when I get there, and I hope to stand before Jesus, and I know I got a lot to answer for, but one of the things I don't want to tell him is that I decided to just ignore 30% of his word. Because he gave it to believers for you to believe, to understand, to know that he is God, and to sit back and enjoy watching the show. We keep praying for God's peace. Lord, give me peace. Give me your peace. He gave it to you. He said, don't be afraid. I know you're going to be in a terrible time, but could you know that I'm in charge? I'm telling you what's happening because only I can tell you that. No, it's me. If you're mine, you're okay. That's a whole different perspective. So now you got 4 horses. You got capitalism and you got communism, socialism. They oppose each other. Look at the other 2 spirits, Christianity and Islam. There's your battle. And they are competing in the end times. Look how God reveals these things as we get closer and closer, because we've been studying this all along, the best scholars in the world. And I'm not telling you, I came up with all of this stuff. I mean, we've been doing some research and looking at other people that have been doing other great research. This is what we're up against. This is it. So thank you. What you want to do is be sure that you go with God's peace. This conference are the ones that you've participated in, others that you bought the DVDs and watched, books that you've read. You're on the bleeding edge. There are a couple of statistics and things I'm going to talk to you about, because in my next 2 sessions I'm going to do on don't buy any green bananas. This is what I call this Hitchhiker's Guide to what's going on in here in the end of days. There are systems and antichrists that are against us that are meant to take everybody down with them. You need to have the discernment to stay away from those. And trusting in God and knowing his word are the 2 biggest things that you can do. These messages and your being here, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but I know that you guys have felt a problem with the world. They don't want to hear you. They don't want to listen to you. Does anybody here have a family or friends who think you are nuts? I know I could get all the hands up at some point, okay? You are, but you're nuts for God, okay? Stay with it, okay? God bless you guys.